The only thing more frightening than being attacked by a bear is being attacked by that very same bear 2 different times in a row. Just after sunrise on a cold October morning, Todd Orr made his way up a hiking trail in the mountains of Montana. This was a scenario that he had been in countless times before. Todd felt completely comfortable solo hiking through the wilderness. He had all the right gear to keep him safe, including a 10mm 911 pistol and an 8-ounce can of bear spray. Todd had hiked a few miles when all of a sudden he saw something that would scare the absolute shit out of pretty much all of us. About 80 yards off in the distance, Todd spotted a 400-pound grizzly bear, and this bear just so happened to be a mama with her cubs right by her side. Now, I can't imagine that Todd took pleasure in seeing this bear, but I tend to believe that he probably wasn't as scared as most people would be, as you or myself would be. And the reason I say that is because Todd was born and raised in the mountains of Montana, and he had spent the past 25 years working for the United States Forest Service. He had seen countless other bears in the wild over the course of his life, and besides, on the tiny chance that something did go wrong, once again, he had that gun and he had that bear spray to protect him. He had 2 defensive weapons, so what could possibly go wrong? Well, folks, everything went wrong for Todd Orr. This initial bear sighting would quickly turn into the bear charging Todd, and Todd deploying his bear spray. And when this bear was confronted with a thick cloud of pepper mist, well, the bear charged right through it, and it slammed right into Todd. The next series of events that would follow this are a mix of just frightening and miraculous and violent. And when all was said and done, folks, this was probably one of the most infamous bear attacks of all time. It went super viral, and I feel very honored today to tell you the story of Todd Orr. So I get asked all the time if telling all of these outdoor mystery stories on my channel makes me more scared to go hiking. And the honest truth is that it doesn't. I'm not scared of getting lost. I'm not scared of running into a murderer out on trail. And I'm not scared of dying in a freak accident. I am, however, very scared of grizzly bears and mountain lions, and I'm not afraid to admit it. And those of you that are regular viewers of this channel may have noticed that I've covered nearly every type of outdoor mystery on the channel at this point, with the exception of animal attacks. I've pretty much straight up avoided making videos about animal attacks because they're like the one thing that scares me the most when it comes to spending time in the wilderness. Now, I've never seen a grizzly bear or a mountain lion, let alone had a bad experience with one of them, but they're just so like primally terrifying to me that I've basically refused to tell any stories about their attacks until now. It's time to confront this fear, and what better way to do it than to tell the story of the man, the myth, the legend himself, Todd Orr. This is a story I've known about for years, long before I ever started making videos. And so now I'm gonna tell it to you. So please join me as we head together on a virtual trip to the great state of Montana. And also make sure you hit that subscribe button to help us reach 500,000 subscribers. We're so close, possibly even there by the time you watch this, but we're so close. It would mean a ton if you subscribe to the channel right now, especially since this is such a scary story for me to tell. Oh, and speaking of things that are very scary, did you know that recently there was a significant data breach affecting 2.9 billion social security numbers along with other personal information? Yep, you heard that right. And you also need to hear about this video's sponsor, Aura, because, well, hackers may have just stolen the social security number of every single American. So over 2.9 billion records were stolen from national public data. And these stolen records included things like a person's full name, their address, their date of birth, their phone number, and most importantly, their social security number. And to make matters even worse, members of the hacker group have reportedly released this information publicly online, which pisses me off, frankly, and it should piss every single one of you off as well, in my opinion. So if you weren't taking precautions with your personal information online before you heard about this, well, this should be a huge wake-up call for you. But speaking for myself, I'm honestly not really that worried because, well, I use Aura. Aura monitors my personal data, including my social security number, across places like the dark web and public court records in order to detect and alert me to potential identity theft. And they also give their users up to $5 million in identity theft insurance should the worst case scenario happen. They also provide you with other online security tools, such as a VPN, for instance, all inside one singular app. Folks, now is the time to start protecting your data, and you can actually go to my link, which is aura.com/KyleHatesHiking, to get a 14-day free trial, which will be enough time for Aura to find out if any of your personal data is exposed. I'm not leaving myself and my family vulnerable to data breaches, and you shouldn't either. So one more time, aura.com/KyleHatesHiking, go get that 14-day free trial. And now let's get into the story. You'd genuinely be hard-pressed to find anybody more experienced in the outdoors than Todd Orr. He grew up just a bit outside of Yellowstone National Park in a small town called Ennis, Montana, which is surrounded by wilderness on all sides. Todd spent his childhood exploring pretty much every outdoor pursuit, including hiking, snowboarding, fishing, and including hunting. When it comes to hunting in particular, well, this is an area where Todd really excelled from a very young age, and an area that would eventually lead him to earn a degree in fish and wildlife management from Montana State University. This, in turn, led to a career with the United States Forest Service, where Todd worked as a trail construction engineer in Custer-Gallatin National Forest, which was a job that required him to be outside in the wilderness almost every single day, and usually by himself, by the way. However, this never fazed Todd. In fact, he felt so comfortable alone in the wilderness completely by himself that he actually started a little side hustle selling handcrafted custom knives to hunters and other outdoor recreationists alike. This is just a little side note, but his company is called Skyblade Knives, and I will have a link to it in the description if you want to check it out. On the morning of October 1st, 2016, Todd Orr set out on a solo elk scouting mission. Now, rifle season was still a few weeks away, and Todd knew that his best chance to actually lay his eyes on an elk would be just after the sun came up. He planned to spend most of that day on trail. He was going to take photos, he was going to make notes about animal tracks and scat that he saw, and by the time that he returned to his truck, he hoped to know whether or not it would be worth hunting in the area once rifle season had begun. Todd pulls up and he parks his truck at the empty North Fork Bear Creek trailhead, and then he just set off into the woods. He followed the trail just like he had done hundreds and hundreds of times before. And just like all of those hundreds of previous times, he carried weapons with him as he made his way down the trail. He carried both a 10mm 1911 pistol, and he carried an 8-ounce can of bear spray. Now, you might be wondering why Todd would even bother carrying the bear spray if he was already carrying a firearm. And that's a great question. And the answer is that Todd was experienced, well-practiced, and well-studied when it came to bear spray. Now, what I'm gonna say next is a little bit controversial and definitely still up for debate, but there is research out there suggesting that bear spray is actually more effective against an aggressive bear than a firearm is. Through his passion for hunting and through his work, Todd was experienced with both firearms and bear spray, and he personally believed that bear spray was worth carrying and using in case of a bear attack. But honestly, none of that really would have mattered when Todd first set out on this hike. Of course, he wasn't thinking that he would ever be attacked by a bear. Nobody does. In fact, I would be willing to bet that this thought of an attack didn't even cross his mind when he literally spotted a mama grizzly bear with cubs about 80 yards in front of him. And the reason I say that is because while that is a unnerving circumstance, to put it mildly. It's one that Todd had been in countless times before. And on each and every one of those previous occasions, the bear simply ran away. That's it. That's what bears are supposed to do when they smell or they see a human. That's what they're supposed to do, and that's what they actually do in almost every single circumstance. In fact, that's actually what happened initially this time as well. The bear and her cubs, well, they stared at Todd for a moment, and then they went screaming over the ridge, and they ran out of sight. And so at this point, Todd figured that he wouldn't be seeing those bears ever again. But unfortunately, Todd would see those bears again. And he would actually see them 2 more times, to be exact. Todd Orr was about to find himself in the type of situation that's so rare, so statistically improbable, that it almost doesn't even seem real. So, after seeing the bears run away, Todd waited patiently for a few tense moments, but then he decided that the coast was clear and that he was safe to continue. And besides, the trail he was about to take would actually move him in the opposite direction from where the bears ran away to. And so he takes a deep breath, and then he takes a step forward. Then he takes another step. Then he takes another step, and then another step. He repeats this process no more than 12 times when all of a sudden he hears a noise coming from behind him. Todd turned to look over his left shoulder when he heard this noise, and when he did this, he realized that the very same 400-pound grizzly bear that he had just seen a few moments earlier was now charging directly at him. And folks, these bears can move quick. They can run up to 35 miles per hour. And just think about that. That's enough to get like a speeding ticket in a school zone. So both Todd's training and the speed at which the bear was charging told him that he only had a few seconds to react, a few seconds to save his life. And his first instinctual reaction was that, honestly, this bear was probably bluff charging. Bluff charges are way more common than an actual attack. And so he has this feeling, and then his next instinctual reaction was to grab his bear spray. This is the thing that everyone's gonna debate, like, oh, maybe he should have grabbed his gun. And if you want to do that, then fine. But that's not what I'm here to do. I'm here to tell you what happened. Todd unholstered the can of bear spray. He removed the safety clip, and then he pointed it right at the bear. Todd had even tested this particular can of bear spray only a few weeks prior. And also, due to his job, he had taken numerous bear safety and bear spray classes over the years. And as if that wasn't enough, he had even used bear spray on a charging black bear once earlier in his career. And the reason I'm telling you all of this stuff is to say that if anyone knew how to effectively use bear spray, it was obviously Todd Orr. Within just a few milliseconds, well, Todd realized that this bear actually wasn't bluff charging. She was running full speed ahead, and she left Todd with no other option but to deploy his last line of defense. He unloaded his can of bear spray, putting a thick cloud of orange peppery mist between him and the bear. Now, this mist is supposed to irritate the nose and the throat of the bear, as well as just scare it and cause it to run away. And according to studies that have been done on bear spray, that's exactly what it does 98% of the time. Todd Orr would unfortunately be part of the 2% of circumstances where bear spray doesn't deter the bear. This bear was running so fast, and it was so determined to dominate Todd, that it ran right through the cloud of pepper spray, and it smashed right into Todd. Todd shoved his face into the dirt, and he put his hands around the back of his neck. He was basically helpless at this point. The best thing that he could do was just try to protect his vital organs, and honestly just lay there and take it. He began to feel the bear tearing away at the muscle in his shoulders, his back, and his arms. But then, after only about a split second and 6 bites, the bear began coughing and it ran away. Maybe the bear spray had actually worked after all. The bear had been charging too hard for the spray to stop the initial pounce. But after only a second or two, it appears that the spray caught up to the bear, irritating it to the point where, like, mid-attack, well, it gave up on Todd and it ran out of sight. So Todd just laid there for a second or two, but then he slowly picked himself up to take stock of his injuries. Now, he was bleeding quite a bit, but he could stand and he could walk. He assessed his condition and he realized that while he was certainly seriously injured and he needed to go to the hospital, none of his wounds, none of his injuries were life-threatening. He was all but assured to survive as long as he could make it back to his truck. Once he arrived there, the hard part would be over and he would just have to drive straight to the hospital and he would let the doctors handle it from there. But I repeat myself, that was all predicated on Todd making it back to his truck successfully. He was about 3 miles from the trailhead when he was attacked, and so he knew that his journey back to the truck would be by far the most important 3 miles that he had ever hiked in his life. Still bleeding quite a bit and holding his bear spray at the ready, mind you, Todd got moving. The first number of steps that he took were extremely nerve-wracking. I mean, he knew the bear was still in his general vicinity, even if it had ran away after it felt the effects of the bear spray. And because of these nerves, well, Todd quickly worked up to a very fast hiking pace, and he managed to travel about a half mile. And after making it this far, somehow his nerves actually subsided almost entirely. He no longer feared that the bear would come back for him, and it just so happened that his adrenaline was kind of wearing off now as well. I can only imagine that this came with the price of increased pain from his wounds, but regardless, Todd wouldn't have much time to think about this. He wouldn't have much time to feel this pain, because just when things were starting to look up, well, he heard a branch crack behind him. He turned around to see the very same grizzly bear charging at him once again, except this time the bear was so close to him that he had literally no time to react. He had no time to grab his pistol, no time to even deploy his bear spray. The bear slammed into Todd, knocking him 10 feet forward, and then she began mauling him for a second time. This time was a little different though. And the reason I say that is because, frankly, it was a lot worse. Her level of anger and her level of violence was turned up to a whole nother level. The bear pinned Todd down, and once again, he drew his hands in like this to kind of protect his neck and protect his head. The bear began biting his shoulders and his arms, and then it bit into his forearm so hard that he could literally feel his bone being crushed. When this happened, very understandably so, he reacted in pain. He moaned, he shouted out, and he moved around a little bit. And this movement and the noises that he made seemed to only further enrage the bear, which is obviously not good, but it also was good, because this is the moment that Todd realized an incredibly painful yet life-saving lesson. He realized that his only chance of survival was to essentially play dead. He had no choice but to just lay there and take the mauling while staying as perfectly still as he possibly could. The longer that he moved and reacted, the longer that he showed any signs of life at all, well, the longer that the attack would continue. In order to cope with this reality, well, Todd convinced himself that the attack would end soon because the mama bear would eventually need to go check on her cubs, right? He figured that he just needed to stay there, stay still for just a few more seconds before the bear would wander off. It would be gone. But unfortunately, well, little did he know, he still had a lot more pain to endure. The bear continued mauling him. It would open a gash on his head that would end up bleeding so bad that it basically blinded him. The bear was literally picking him up and then slamming him back down on the ground. Folks, the violence continued and continued until suddenly the bear stopped and it just kind of stood there on top of Todd. Todd held his breath and he just remained motionless as he actually felt the bear's breath on the back of his neck, which is very, very disturbing, a feeling I'm sure he won't ever forget. The bear stood there crushing him for roughly 30 seconds, and then the bear wandered off. It left. This was obviously a huge relief for Todd, but at the same time, he had no idea where the bear went. He just didn't know, right? Like, did the bear leave the scene for good? Did it run away? Or was it just kind of waiting off in the distance, ready to attack a third time and ready to deliver that final blow? Todd's thinking about this, and he just laid there, remaining motionless on the ground for close to a minute, but then he finally decided it was time to move. He mustered up the courage, he got up, and he looked around. His brain immediately went into defense mode, and so he thought about his gun. He stood up and he realized that his pistol had actually been tossed from his chest holder during the attack, and so he went over to it, he picked it up, and he cocked the hammer, and then he kind of just stood there and inspected his immediate surroundings, obviously looking for the bear. And much to his relief, well, he couldn't see the bear. She was still nowhere to be found, and so Todd grabbed the rest of his gear, including the bear spray, of course, and once again, he began moving down the trail towards his car. After he started moving, he had a second to kind of process what had happened, and he was in complete disbelief that he had been attacked not once, but twice, and had somehow survived both attacks. During this second getaway, Todd hiked at a slower pace as he made his way down the trail, and the reason that he did this is because he wanted to keep his heart rate as low as possible in order to limit bleeding. He had also once again made the decision that his best chance of survival came with reaching his truck as soon as possible, rather than spending precious time attempting to treat his wounds on the spot. And by the way, his wounds were much worse after this second attack than they were after the first attack. His left arm was rendered completely useless, and he actually kept it tucked in against his body while he was hiking out in order to prevent further injury and to minimize pain. He also tucked his pistol in with his damaged arm, and then he held his bear spray in his other arm while he was hiking out. And speaking of hiking out, it took him about 45 minutes, which is pretty impressive given the circumstances. For 45 minutes, he stumbled down the trail, stopping only twice to briefly assess his bleeding. By some miracle, folks, he reached his truck. And this was the moment, for the first time since the second attack, that Todd knew with 100% certainty that he was going to survive. He had done the hard work. All he needed to do now was to drive himself to the hospital. That was the most important thing, but Todd decided to add 2 bonus steps before he hit the road. The first thing that he did after he reached the trailhead was to actually try and warn other people about the dangerous bear. And I think this is a perfect illustration of Todd's character. I mean, he was literally bleeding, and by now I'm sure the adrenaline had worn off and he was in severe pain. You know, he really needed to get to the hospital as soon as possible, but he still paused for a moment, pulled out a notepad from his truck, and attempted to write a warning note so that he could put it at the trailhead to warn other people about the bear. Unfortunately, despite his intentions here, he actually had to give up this idea because he was trying to write the note and his arms and his body was so damaged, and he was also dripping with so much blood that, well, the note was just completely illegible, and so eventually he gave up and he moved on to something else. Todd figured that some of his hunting buddies might appreciate it, so he actually began taking selfies of his current condition. He's standing there covered in blood and he's taking photos of himself. And then he actually took a video. He made a quick clip just kind of recounting his brush with death, his brush with this grizzly bear. And later on, that very same video would end up on Facebook and would end up going completely viral. I'm sure a lot of you have probably seen this video. I remember seeing it way back at the time when this happened, way before I had a YouTube channel, way before I was thinking about covering stories like this. And unfortunately, I can't actually play anything from his viral video because, well, frankly, it's way too graphic and it would get this video banned immediately. But if you really want to find it, and I highly advise some discretion if you do, because it's very graphic, but if you really want to find it and you look hard enough on Google, you're going to be able to find it. But anyways, Todd finished filming this video and then he got into his truck. He drove himself 30 minutes to the nearest emergency room, stopping only once to ask a local rancher to alert the hospital that he was on the way. And just another side note, can you imagine being that rancher? Like, can you imagine a guy pulling up in a pickup truck covered in blood and just being like, hey, do you mind calling the hospital and telling them that I'm on my way? I got attacked by a bear. Like, can you imagine? Just insane. When Todd arrived at the emergency room, his pain and his injuries literally prevented him from doing simple things like being able to put his truck in park and unbuckle his seatbelt. That's how bad his injuries were. I mean, the muscles and the tendons in both of his arms were badly damaged, and he had puncture wounds all over his upper body. He laid there in the hospital for nearly 8 hours as doctors stitched him up, and then he went home. He got a few hours of rest, and then he returned the next morning for a series of surgeries. 2 of Todd's tendons in his left forearm had been completely torn. He also had extensive nerve damage, he had broken bones, and of course, he had muscle damage. His road to recovery would be very, very long, but within 6 weeks of the attack, Todd was healthy and mobile enough to actually go hiking again. And as I'm sure you can maybe imagine, the trail that he chose to go hiking on this time was the very same trail that he had nearly died on. That's right, folks. He went back to the attack sites only 6 weeks after the attack. This time he brought along a friend, and he went back to try and face his fears. And I'm happy to report that, well, it must have worked, because within just a few more months, Todd was back at work surveying trails for the Forest Service, often, once again, in the wilderness, completely by himself. He would go on to make a near full recovery from the attack. I mean, he's basically back to normal with only a few lingering effects in his left hand and his left forearm. I actually had the great pleasure of speaking with Todd in preparation for this video, and one thing that I was really curious about was why his bear spray didn't stop the bear during that first attack. I'm sure this is something that a lot of you are wondering about as well, and so allow me to read you his response. Quote, "The bear was in a full charge at 35 or 40 miles per hour and didn't slow at all when she got close. So she blasted through the cloud of spray in a fraction of a second, and it took a few seconds before it got to her sinuses and began irritating her. She bit me a half dozen times and then started coughing from the spray and took off. So it definitely worked and deterred her, just a few second delay due to the speed of the attack. Most bears would bluff charge and stop short. That's where they get a full blast of spray and usually turn around and run." It's also worth mentioning that Todd wrote an entire blog post about why the bear spray didn't stop his attacks, and so I'll link it below, and I highly recommend that you read through it before you start commenting on the effectiveness of firearms versus bear spray when it comes to bear attacks like this. I would also highly recommend that you go check out Todd's company, Skyblade Knives. Now, this isn't sponsored, and he's not paying me to say this, but I will say that these knives look super, super cool. I think they'd make like a great present for your loved one who likes to hunt or likes the outdoors. And, well, frankly, Todd was nice enough to let me cover his story without asking for anything in return, and so I figured that giving his company a shout out was the least that I could do. Once again, the link to his knife company is also in the description. Folks, Todd Orr is a certified badass. I'm so thankful that he survived, and I'd encourage you to please show him some love in the comment section right now. YouTube seems to think that you'd enjoy watching this video next, so give it a click, and folks, thank you so much for watching this, and I'll see all of you next week.